There are 6 advantages to a trust over a will. In this episode, I'm going to address the question, what's the difference between a will and a living trust? And you're going to understand at least 6 distinct advantages of a trust, but why I would recommend you have a will and a trust. So on this YouTube channel, Three Dimensional Wealth, I post a lot of answers to questions like this. I would invite you to subscribe. I post an answer to a financial question if you put the bell, the notification every single day. But I want you to understand the dynamics behind being educated, because that is power. Now, when people ask what is the difference between a will and a trust, first of all, I say, well, with a will, where there's a will, there's a, and they say, way. I go, no, there's a probate. And so let me explain what a will does, and then what a living trust does, and why a living trust has 6 advantages over just a will. But you should have both of them working in coordination with each other, which is a topic of another YouTube video in this series. So I'm Doug Andrew, and I've taught a lot of advanced continuing education to estate planning attorneys. I'm not an attorney, but I train them on how to set up equal opportunity living trusts instead of equal distribution trusts, which is another topic. But generally speaking, when we talk about the difference between just a will and a trust, what does a will do? If I super simplify it, a will does 2 major things. It names the guardian of your minor children. If you pass away and you have minor children, who is going to be the guardian? You can name it, because if you die without a will, that's called dying intestate, the state where you live has a will for you, and most people don't like the state's will. The state may say, you know what? We're going to divide up your kids. You have 4 kids. We're going to divide up 2 over to this sibling and 2 over to this one. Maybe that's not what you wanted, but you're stuck if you die intestate without a will. Now, when you have a will, it also decides how your assets will be distributed to your heirs. But with a will, you have to be probated. Now, probate isn't necessarily bad, but what is probate? Probate is making sure your will is followed under the jurisdiction of a court. But what happens is that can be costly, and it can take a year and a half to go through probate. Now, certain things, it may behoove you to go through probate. The example I use is that if you have some little asset that is worthless, a motorcycle, an old tractor, something, I will tell my clients, leave that out of the trust if they set up a trust, and probate that. Because one advantage of probate is that when you die and you post the legal notice in the newspaper saying this estate is going to be probated, basically creditors have 6 months to come forward and make claims. After that, forever hold your peace. They can't come and do that. If you don't probate your estate, they could come 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years later. I've seen doctors and dentists where people come back and try to sue them 15 years later. If you probated the estate, no, they had their chance within 6 months. So you want to have some worthless asset that's probated, but the rest of it, I think, ought to be over in the trust. Where there's a will, there's a probate. So what happens is, first of all, the court has to decide, is there any federal tax owed, any state tax owed, any local tax? Those are the first 3 in line. Then you have to take care of the court costs, the attorney fees, and the executor fees on the estate. And then number 7 are the creditors. You got to make sure all the creditors are taken care of. That they're not going to come out of the woodwork saying, hey, your father owed me some money. Once those 7 are taken care of, then it's the heir's turn to get what's left. That's called probate. And that process can take months and even years on large estates. So to avoid probate, many people will set up a living trust. But a living trust does more than just avoid probate. If you die with a trust, basically your estate is settled instantly in one day. That's one advantage. It avoids probate. Now, number two, people set up trust because they want to keep things private. So privacy. If you have a will and it's probated, it's public information. Anybody can go down to the courthouse and look up what you owned. And if you like to keep things private, set up a trust because now it's private. So privacy is number two. What's number three? When you have a trust, it tends to preserve the love of the family better. In other words, sometimes when you die without a will or even a will, there's fighting among siblings on, well, who really gets Aunt Effie's vase? Who gets Dad's watch? Who gets this? Well, that painting on the wall. And a lot of times parents will write down on the back of the painting or whatever. But see, a will designate who gets those things. And if you don't do that, I have seen families just never speak to each other again. I would rather my children get zip than to have them stop speaking to each other and destroy the love of my family. So a trust is cut and dried. The successor trustees have to do exactly with the assets what the trust says. So pretty much there's no argument, and it tends to hold together the families better than just a will or dying intestate using the state's will. So we have got avoidance of probate, you have privacy, it preserves the love of the family. You also, if you have estate tax, now at certain times you may not have to worry about estate tax. At the time of the recording of this video, my heavens, you could leave behind about $11 million, $22 million total between the husband and wife before you would trigger an estate tax. But I remember that in the 1990s, for example, any part of your estate, if your estate was valued at more than $600,000, or at the year 2000, more than $1 million, anything above that was taxed at 37% and topped out at 55% as it passed down to the children. And so when you have a trust, that generally doubles the exclusion that you would have. If we sunset in the year 2026 back to what the tax laws before Trump changed them, then that means a husband could have up to 5 point something million and the wife could have up to that. If you don't have a trust, it's only 5 million between the two of you. So it saves unnecessary estate tax on large estates. And frankly, many Democrats want to do away with that and move it clear back to $1 million because they love to tax people who were 6 feet under. They can't complain, okay? So it is a place where tax revenues like to go after tax. So it can save unnecessary estate tax. The other advantage is liability protection. When you have a trust, generally between the husband and wife, you have like an A-B trust where maybe the house is half in the husband's trust, half in the wife's. Or in my case, I keep the domestic assets in my wife's trust. I keep the business assets in my trust. If I get sued, they can't come after anything that I don't own, the house and so forth, that's owned by my wife. If my wife gets sued, they can't wipe me out halfway in my business. But a trust will sort of limit to the amount of liability exposure in this sue happy society to where somebody could only wipe you out maybe halfway if you or your spouse was responsible for an accident or somebody got hurt when you were driving the car or what have you. So liability protection. But the last benefit of a trust most people don't think about. It's what I call the second spouse syndrome. I'll give you a little story here. I had a client, he was an electrician and he worked his entire career, couldn't wait until he could retire with his wife. 90 days after she retired, she had a massive heart attack. He was lonely. He married another woman and she was after everything he had. I was named as a successor trustee on his trust and his wife's trust. The new wife said, "Prove to me your love. Put everything in my name." He was angry that I did not take the assets out of his deceased wife's trust and put it over into his trust or with his new wife. He was actually livid. And I said, "I can't do that." Well, as soon as she got everything she could in her name out of his trust, she said, "Bye-bye." And she took off. He was destitute on his assets. He was so grateful. He came back and thanked me for not doing what he originally wanted me to do, and that's to move the assets over all into his trust. I couldn't do that without violating it. The beneficiaries, the kids, would have sued me. And so that is the only thing he had the remainder of his life to maintain integrity and not outlive his money. But see, what happens is sometimes when you have a second marriage, if you don't have a trust, then many times the original person passes away and the new spouse and their kids get all of the assets, and your kids don't get anything. They've been disinherited because people get remarried. They don't name their children as the successor trustees. They want to take care of their new spouse, but after they die, it should go back to your kids, not somebody else's kids that you don't even know right now. That's what I call the second spouse syndrome, and it happens more often than you would think. So a trust has those 6 benefits that a will does not have. You still have a will that if you forget to put something in the trust, when you die, those assets go through probate, which may not be bad if they're not worth very much, and then they're put into the trust. But anything in the trust avoids probate. It preserves the love of the family. It protects you from liability lawsuits, wiping you completely out. It keeps things private. And the biggest thing is the second spouse syndrome, and it saves unnecessary estate tax. So if you want to learn more, type in questions, search my channel here. I do address a lot of questions relating to wills and trusts. And I want you to be empowered with the right information. And then there's also opportunities to be able to go in and get a copy of one of my books. You just pay the $5.95 shipping and handling. I'll pay for the book and ship it out to you free. You'll learn all kinds of dynamic strategies that will protect your assets that you've worked hard for your entire life.